Okay, thank you, Augusto. Thank you all for being here to learn something about the relationship of plants and soils in the tropics. So I'm working at INPA, which is the Brazilian National Institute for Amazonian Research. And I'm about here in the middle, very middle of the Amazon. This is where I live. And so I start with something that is very obvious for plant ecologists, but I don't know if it's obvious for soil researchers, which is the strong connection that plants have to soil types in terms of soil fertility and soil texture, which affects drainage. So this relationship happens from very local scales, such as those in topographical gradients, where soil drainage changes, but also we can have changes in soil texture and chemistry. And we see these very strong patterns of plant turnover. So different species occurring in the low areas and higher areas. And we can have also differences in vegetation composition among different soil patches with different properties, even if it's not driven by topography. And in the large scale, such as the Amazon, in the more regional scale, we have more recently showing that soil can be as a strong driver of plant distribution as climate, in terms of limiting species ranges. So it has been long understood that climate limits ranges. Nobody discusses that, but it was not so clear how soil affected that. And we see here in these orange-red colors that for a large part of the Amazon, it is soil properties who actually limit how far the ranges of species go. And climate limits these distributions just in the borders where the climate meets drier conditions. And this relationship between plants and soils is so strong, as we can see here for ferns, for example, that have very narrow ranges in terms of soil fertility they require, that we can use that to map the soil properties using ferns as indicators. This is very important for us in the Amazon because the soil collection is so sparse that maps of soil fertility based on soil samples are very poor. They have a very large uncertainties. So using plants, and especially combining plants and soil samples, we can have much better maps for soil fertility. So knowing this, knowing that soil is so strong driver of plant ranges, we decided to check how this would affect the future distributions of plants under climate change. So usually the ranges of species in the future under drier and warmer conditions is projected based on climate only. But as I showed before, we see that soil has a strong, poses a strong constraint on plant distribution. So when we model the ranges in the present, we see that the ranges are strongly affected by soil. So here it's ranges that are lower than what is predicted by only climate. And when we project this in the future under different scenarios of climate change, we see that several plant species actually cannot move to favorable conditions as defined by climate only. So they will have much less opportunity to migrate because the soil does not allow the colonization of new favorable climates. And we can see here an example for just one species. So the map shows the present distribution here as modeled just by climate. And when we add soils, we see that the species is not so largely distributed as predicted by climate only. And this has a huge impact in the future distribution. You see that projecting the warmer and drier climates, these species would kind of colonize all the Amazon, but it's not the real thing when we see, when we include the soil. So the soil is very important to understand the future of plants. Well, and you guys, the soil science know this better than me. Well, it's not just about soil fertility, it's also about soil hydrology. And in the drier projected future, which is actually already happening, we have these responses that differ in terms of tree growth and tree mortality, in terms of drought severity. So forests that have deep water tables, so those in the higher topographic positions, tend to suffer a lot from drought. They decrease growth, they increase mortality. But the forests that have humid soils, those that can have the input of groundwater, they seem protected, as you see here in the blue line. They do not increase mortality and they don't change growth. So it seems that the soil conditions, the local water conditions in the soil are key to the future of forests under drought. And we can make some prediction in terms of what might happen as the climate becomes drier. So the increase in the drier period, we project that this will decrease waterlogging in these shallow water table forests. The decrease in waterlogging in the wet period means less anoxia for soil, for roots, for tree roots, which means they have a large period for biomass productivity, because waterlogging functions more or less like winter in the temperate zone. So trees are kind of hibernating in this period because of this constraint of anoxia. So it might be that for these forests in the shallow water tables could save the production of biomass. Of course, it depends on the balance between climate and local hydrological conditions, but here we don't have time to go through that. Another implication for biodiversity, and as I showed you before, there is this strong species turnover along topography, which means actually the water table depth. And if we project drier climates in the future, it means the soils in the upper positions of the topography will become much drier than the soils in the lower parts that can have the supply from groundwater. And these plants in the drier positions might actually migrate downslope. So it's kind of the same principle that people are seeing in the mountains, that plants are going up in the mountains when the climate becomes hotter in the bottom. But here is the opposite. Plants are going down the mountain, or well, at least the topography, because it's wetter down there. And so this means that the soil properties in terms of fertility, in terms of drainage, are very key to understand the responses of plants in the future under climate change. And so thank you, and let's have questions if you do.
Wow. Thank you, Flavia. It was, we understand, clearly understand. Even the last slide in which we see the species that go down the mountain instead of up to the mountain in the Alps, for instance. It's interesting, very interesting. And thank you.